Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. This week, and it is 4th July on the day of the release of this episode. So happy Freedom Day for Americans. And of course, because it's 4th July, we are going to discuss Independence Day, not the movie. So if you came in for the movie, I'm sorry, but that's not what we're going to discuss today. It's, of course, the event in 1776 that led up to the creation of Independence Day, 4th July. And this week, I'm joined by Thomas Mackie, who is a fifth time on this podcast, and he's the only one who's been here 5 times on the podcast, and we can't get enough of this guy. But also, we have another. I'm not mentioned this before, of course, but we do have another project, don't we, Thomas? So why don't you begin before we get into the Independence Day? We're going to derail a little bit because we do have a podcast, the two of us. So why don't you tell them about our little podcast?
Yeah, for the fun side of things, we chat about Star Trek. Here we go.
Nice one.
Um, and as a way of kind of looking at Star Trek as a cultural icon, not just of America, it's really quite a global icon. It goes much beyond us. With the whole genre, we play with the ideas of um, what does it mean for us? How does it represent us? How does it kind of play with that one?
And the
And just kind
history
of get
flavor,
into
because there's a lot of historical references
Oh
and
yeah, the
historical.
references to and just to play just the fun thing of chatting, nerding out on a favorite TV show and all its various ideations, both the good, the bad, and oh my gosh, they actually filmed that kind of thing. Yeah, so yeah, there are times, and that's a fun piece, and we all show our Star Trek toys, um, and kind of get into the how maybe certain shows portray myth, like last time we discussed the Old West and the myth of the Old West, and then Star Trek becoming a myth of the myth of the Old West, which is kind of a fun thing to kind of get into. That's fun.
And we do fun episodes as well. For example, in the next week from after this episode on the Star Trek show, we're going to pay respect in memoriam to all the red shirts
All
who
the veterans
died
died.
under James T. Kirk. And we are actually going to mention all the names
Yep,
because there
yep.
is a website that dedicate to all the men who died in service of James T. Kirk, and it's quite a lot of people.
That was a fun
So
website to go over. I thought, oh my, that's it.
So we are actually going to talk about how they died in service of James
Yeah,
C.
yeah.
Church, and that's going to be a fun episode that you don't want to miss. So please do check out the podcast is short. It will be linked down below. So check out To Boldly Talk, where no man has talked before. See what I did there? I just love the title of the podcast. But no, let's get back to what we actually are going to talk about, which is Independence Day. And before I want to begin with I want to begin at the very beginning of the American, sorry, I was about to say the French Revolution, but that's a little too early. But we're going to begin with the American Revolution, and I want to begin at what led up to the French. Sorry, I keep saying French, but I'm going to say American Revolution. So let's begin with
Yeah.
with what led up to the American Revolution in the first place.
All right. How do you want to lead off? I guess the French Revolution is
Sorry,
inter
The American
yeah,
Revolution.
but the
My
French Revolution
mistake.
is interrelated with ours, as well as the Haitian Revolution. They're linked together in this movement in the 18th century that you had this almost these reactions to the monarchies of Europe. Um, the very strict, the stringent monarchies here, and I think people also had reacting to it. They were sick and tired of the religious wars because the Catholic and Protestant churches had become wedded to the monarchies, their favorite monarchies. And when you put those two together, even going back to Constantine the Great, um, when Christians became Rome, or the Latin Church became Roman, I said, and the Byzantine Church became, so you had this, you in both big halves of Christendom, it really perverts the thing. Anyway, I think many people, particularly if you're the intellectual, the educated elite of the 1760s, just looking at the conditions they were in, were upset. But what actually looks at the revolution is a whole other set of circumstances, like a storm of messes. Um, you have a war of empire, for example, between the powers of Europe controlling the sugar islands, the Caribbean, controlling wealth, controlling trade.
The 7 Years' War, of course.
7 years, yeah, in your case, we put 7 years of French any more for us, which started over here. Thank you, George Washington. But it was going to happen anyway. I tend to think that was going to happen anyway, because no one is really trying to stop it. You don't have, within this power structure, you don't have really any party saying war is simply a stupid way of managing our problems. You have an economy that believes it's all or nothing. You don't have the idea of free trade, meaning there's enough wealth for everyone. You believe, well, there's only just so much wealth, so I'm going to grab mine, because if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. And so if you have that attitude toward anything, you're going to be fighting. One of the ironic things that I found, it took me long in my career to grasp this, by the way, so I'm not real proud of this one, is that in the colony, and I use all the colonies, the British colonies particularly, but you had French and you had Dutch and Spanish and Portuguese colonies, all milling about and bumping into one another in the Western Hemisphere, causing all sorts of mayhem and misery in some cases, but making fabulous amounts of wealth in doing this and interacting in ways that have never been done before, for good and bad. So
I think we should, sorry for interrupting you again, but I think we should also mention that, the colonies, at least the American ones, weren't very much heavily taxed before the 7 Years' War. So they were really well.
Not as bad, actually, not as bad as even in the British. I mean, some scholars have looked at this, and we look at tax rates and think, it was pretty good, particularly in the New England colonies. You had it pretty good. The problem came, and this is where I tend to look at this, two things. One, Americans in the political world are thinking that they're heavily English. They're heavily influenced by more than the Dutch, more than French, more than Spanish, even though they had others here. They're much more influenced by an older generation of English radicals, the Whigs. They're heavily influenced in that thing. It's in the language we're using. For example, in Massachusetts and New York, and they're using language that is very similar to what the Puritans would have used in the 1660s and 70s and 80s. The English had stopped using it. They were done. They were in a much more of a conservative mode. They had left the radical behind. Americans are still thinking radically. Also, economy here, we're making money smuggling. Americans are making a great deal using free trade before there's a free trade, and ignoring the basics of the British Board of Trade. In doing that, we knew in the 17 teens and 20s that there were colonist governors who were under the pay of pirates. Blackbeard had, where do the big pirates sell their goods? They sell them in the colonies. So we had this relationship with lawlessness, which the British Board of Trade finds uncomfortable, to put it mildly. The British have their own problems. They have an empire that has grown faster than they expected. They were not prepared for this. The governing of Lord North, the Grenville, and King George's, they were not prepared for what was going to happen. And you got to get a grip on things.
It is interesting, and I read what's her name now? Caroline Enkin's book, and she labels the era of the colonies after Britain's first empire.
First empire, right? And that's correct. I think that's correct. It is a type of, and others have used several kind of empires. You also have a religious empire, a very Protestant empire. Books I read from my book club talks about this one. So there, you can go, it's a very global activity, or very Atlantic world activity.
What was the percentage in the colonies at the time of Catholics and Protestants? Were there most majority Catholics or Protestants?
Boy, I'm in dangerous territory here to give you an actual percentage. Maryland was established as a Catholic colony, was highly protested and fought against by the Puritans in Massachusetts. So you have a very militant anti-Catholic population here. You have a modest Catholic population in Maryland, in the Maryland area. Some, I guess, also in other parts, southern colonies. But it's a small group. They just want to be left alone. They're not militant. They are, but they're trying to avoid the persecution in England, you know. But there was a lot of memory, old memory, of the Catholic Protestant wars of the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
And memory is kept alive in Massachusetts and Connecticut. You know, they don't forget that those anger points. And so you have these parties in a sense already established in these 13 separate colonies. Remember, these 13 colonies that rebelled are only part of the 20-some English colonies in the Western Hemisphere. When things start going south in the 1760s, after the 7 Years' War, a lot of it's just happening anyway because the British Board of Trade they're just trying to keep control of their navigation acts, that kind of thing, and they have they're not doing anything, i.e., unconstitutional, but they are indeed irritating American legislators. Two particular ones that always stick out in my mind, and they stick out in a lot of literature: Patrick Henry from Virginia, and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts. They're ornery, they are intriguing characters. The interesting thing I found is that they're probably among what we call our founding generation, the most, I use the word carefully, but probably inaccurately, evangelical Christian among the bunch. They are very much in the new age of Christianity, of the Great Awakening. They are very much experience-based Christians. However, they have formed a dislike personally of the British Board of Trade, and they probably are not real thrilled with the monarchy either. And frankly, some of them probably do have economic incentives that would incentivize them to favor a limited link to the British Empire, as limited as possible. They'll fly the flag, just don't make me do anything. Kind of loyalty. That's the level of loyalty you have here. And Americans have been on their own. And I use the word carefully because it's not an accurate word. The colonies, Pennsylvanians, North Carolinians, South Carolinians, they're from Barbados. They have a complete connection. Georgians, Massachusetts, in this area, they have their own attitudes. They've formed a culture of their own. Their languages are even starting to form differently. They're even beginning to speak a different version of English than the British are speaking. The British have evolved differently. Language is different, even though they're linked carefully. They have formed their own governing forms, and it comes out of a lot of 17th century thinking, or it's evolved entirely separate and altogether differently. And so when the British Empire is forced into close proximity to the American, particularly the 13, but all the colonies, due to the 7 Years' War, they're finding out that these blasted Massachusetts folks, they're still trading with the French and the Dutch and the Spanish and they're heavily linked to Brazil, Portuguese, completely outside the Board of Trade's control. And they're losing money off this. Well, that's not fair to them, they think. And so a lot of this is just stewing in the policies. And the English Parliament is simply thinking, well, we've earned this. We paid the money for this. We deserve this. Some have argued that the British are trying to control their expenses. Other historians say, I don't think so as much. I think the British biggest fear in the 13 colonies is another Pontiac War, like the 1760s. They cannot afford repeated Indian wars on the frontier. Those are horribly expensive. They don't get anything back off it. you're moving a large number of troops constantly, and that's expensive because you're taking these guys away from home. And it's not just the army. All the army support people. That's their wives, their girlfriends, the kids. The servant they're bringing along. They're bringing along called camp followers, and they got to pay them too. And so you have that's expensive. That's a big thing. And they're away from home. They're not near their home units anymore, and it disturbs their peace of mind. And so when the British are fearing they have another, when they're stocking troops here, well, the East Coast says, "What do you mean you're putting troops here? That means it's messy." We also have a form of protest which has evolved here. It did in Europe as well. The Irish protested a lot. Poor English had a traditional protest, and they felt that it was their right to burn things and to hang leaders in effigy, to show their disapproval. Somewhat like a Halloween, for the poor. And so you have these kind of actions, which by 1770s is becoming really disturbing to the parliament. And so you have basically a miscommunication. You have greed and avarice, like in everybody else, in the matter. And you're starting to see language that is coming out of the Enlightenment. And it's being adapted very seriously. As a friend of mine, Michael Hatton, has written about remembering the revolution, is that we're retelling ourselves histories. We're actually literally retelling histories to ourselves. We're rebuilding our own histories of the British Empire. We're looking back at the Glorious Revolution. We're looking back at the civil wars in England. And we're retelling, and we're basically reframing the whole thing. And then we're reframing our own history. Thomas Hutchinson, became governor of Massachusetts during the Revolution, poor guy, is an American-born, elite. His grandmother, great-grandmother was Anne Hutchinson, who was basically tormented by the New England Puritans. He hated Puritans. He despised these guys, for good reason. He had a family grudge against these people. And so here we have this. This is the context of the political debate. The political debate centers around, does the parliament have the right to establish rules that are going to end up taxing directly or even indirectly any of the colonies? Now, when Sam Adams is arguing about, and Otis Warren, they're arguing about this, they're saying Jamaica should be on our side, and so does Barbados and Quebec and Nova Scotia. They belong with us. Well, when it got down to it, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Jamaica, and Barbados, they didn't care. They were not. They cared. They didn't like Parliament's actions, but they were not willing to stick their necks out or willing to irritate the British Empire because their dependence on the Navy, perhaps, or their interests weren't that tied into it. Also, they weren't that angry, or they weren't willing to keep the anger going. To have a revolution, someone has got to keep the anger stoked up. Someone has got to keep poking the bear. And that's people like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry. And there are others. They're not alone. Those names just come. There are a lot of other lawyers and activists. And they're stoking the fire. They're poking the bear constantly. War really kind of breaks out indirectly in 73 and 74 with violent actions like even before that you have we call the Boston Massacre. Some books, in fact, my dissertation professor, Mitch Kachun, talks about this one, the memory of the massacre through Crispus Attucks. And there are others who discuss the whole issue of the language of calling it a massacre. Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at the event, you have an outnumbered garrison of men with flintlock muskets.
If I remember correctly, those muskets weren't very accurate at the time.
No, well, I mean, they're not inaccurate, but I mean, you have one shot, baby. if you're good, 3 to 4 shots a minute. Well,
It's not an AK-47, let's put it that way.
no, it's not. And so these, I think 7, 8 guys, they are facing a mob of maybe 100. John Adams is not entirely honest because he calls them as Jack Tars, Navy SEALsmen. We have mariners, we have riders and boys. Well, you have teens, you have radicals, you have guys who are on the rope walk who hated the British because they took their jobs. You have all sorts of people on the lower end of the social scale. And it's their protest, right? So they're throwing rocks, snowballs, ice balls, actually. And you're thinking they've already killed people. They've already, hurt people. They have, this is going to turn ugly. And you have troops that are trying, they're as scared as anybody else. Come on, they know they can't outgun them. And they're being taunted. So somebody fires a shot and then everybody, a bunch of others fire. They hear things they don't hear, and there is no clear message. When the trial comes out, the one thing is clear that the British really they were not guilty of murder. That was clear. John was able to convict. Now, Sam wanted them convicted of murder, but he wanted them to, Sam wanted a political statement. And his buddy, Paul Revere, another of the radicals, was willing, he was willing to lie out the yazoo to get this right. And they lied utterly to stoke the pressure. There was no interest in actually calming things down. There was absolutely no interest in calming this down. That group, Sons of Liberty, the Sinn Féin of our world, they had no interest. They were going to hurt people. They wanted a violent uproar. Maybe not a war, but they wanted the violence because they knew that would keep people emotionally involved. At this time, most of the churches were not really linked into it, except maybe those who were like the Baptist congregation, again, the Puritan churches. They already hated the king. They already despised, that's inherited from years back.
And I think we did not mention that George, of course, after the 7 Years' War, had to raise taxes in the States as well.
Well, he does because there's a need to, pay for things, I suppose, but not any more than the British already were taxed. If you were in Cornwall and places, yes, you got taxed. The taxes here were probably, when I look, even going way back in the research of this, Charles Beard was the first to kind of critique the patriotic language. They were not that bad. There were, we look at the actual actions, we read the Declaration of Independence and the accusations against George, and it doesn't ring very true. They really don't.
But it seemed to be enough for the revolutionaries that it kind of, even if it's not much, it's kind of enough for them to go like, oh, we had it with you, you Brits. We're gonna come after you now.
You poke the bear, and you make the troops angry, and you want them to shoot at you. You want the violence. You don't want to get killed, but you want some violence. And there's an inherent dishonesty. When I look at it myself, I said, there's a disingenuity behind this. I'm not a real big fan of the revolution. I'm really not a big fan, except that the British Parliament were arrogant. When I have to go back over and look at, okay, how did they speak about the colonies, particularly the 13, eventually Massachusetts and Connecticut. One of the things British did that was real screw up, the Board of Trade, is they really fried Franklin's bacon. Ben Franklin was an agent. In fact, that's how we were represented for the colonies. The colonies would hire agents who would represent their colonies in Parliament, but not as a voting member, but they would tell you, if you're in Parliament, okay, here's what's going on. You can't do, this is going to really tick people. They were the ones who would kind of inform the leaders in Parliament as to what the real conditions were on the ground. Now, it's hard to do when you've got a 3-week, 4-week, traveling range, but you had basically every couple of days, you had ships going back and forth. So you do have messages, and there is regular communication. But it's not consistent, and the different agents don't have authority necessarily to do things as they should be able to do. Parliament begins to kind of ignore that. They kind of assume they know better, which is always a bad thing. When a politician assumes they know better, I go, oh dear Lord, this is going to go bad. This is not going to go well. And this is what happens when this is going on. Franklin had gotten a hold of Hutchinson's letters. Franklin is not an honest man himself. Franklin's a bit of a behind the scenes guy, not a gal with a lot of character. But Franklin gets caught with some letters he should not have had. And the Board of Trade takes a chance, and they just roast him alive. Franklin is not allowed to say anything, and they spend like an hour or so, and they chew him up in public. Embarrassingly, he's humiliated. And I think now Franklin has to put up with this. But in doing so, they have turned who would have been the best linkage between Parliament and the colonies into their arch enemy. They've done this with other people as well. They have managed to turn people who would be good middle ground negotiators in a debate. People who know both sides. They see both sides. They're rational. And they're turned into ardent American patriots because you have offended them personally. You have made their lives absolutely miserable. You have humiliated them. The worst thing to do to somebody who is willing to negotiate is to humiliate them. And this is what the British Parliament did in abundance. And in doing that, you turn people who were moderates in America, in the Americas, into people who said, okay, if that's the way you're going to be about it, this is going to go badly with you. And so when the First Continental Congress meets, they're already ticked off. Now, the Southern colonies, they have not had any beef with the British Parliament, near as much. South Carolina has a fine relationship going. They're doing well, thank you very much. But a lot of their dealings are with the
For once, the
Caribbean.
South is not a problem.
Yeah, the North is the problem. Because they're a maritime province. New Massachusetts early on began its, the lousy farmland. If you're in Massachusetts, it's a lousy place to farm if you want to make a living. You can do gardening, but farming, I'm sorry, it's crap. It's awful.
I'm sorry to the Massachusetts listeners out there.
Yes, yeah, my apologies go to, but I've been there. It's not good for commercial farming. For farming in big scale, no, it doesn't work. You need flat land, you need better climate, you need better soil. It doesn't have it there. The Carolinas and Virginia, even though they waste it on tobacco, but later on they can develop better farming, and it's just better suited. Well, anyway, the anger does start in Massachusetts because they're relying on their shipping, and the British are basically, the Navigation Act does begin to bite into the profit line a lot. And they've been used to dealing away with ignoring it. Well, now they can't ignore it. By the late 60s, they can't ignore it. And the British are enforcing what was always unenforced before. And I took my example. You have middle schoolers, 6th grade, 7th grade kids. 13, 14, 15 years old, 15, 14 years old. And they have been allowed to have an hour and a half lunch break and recess. And because of testing, you said, okay, you're down to half an hour only. You're going to have some very angry kids. Their rights have been offended. Their honor has been besmirched. And then the principal calls them babies. Oh, okay. It's on now, kid. It's on. It is on. We're gonna have a fight. This is, he uses simple language. This is kind of what's going on, and it's particularly in the New England colonies. Now, New Yorkers hate Massachusetts. They despise them with a deep and abiding passion. They've already had wars with Massachusetts, okay, and Connecticut. They don't like them. The 13 colonies hate one another badly. Quebec knows I don't like any of you because you hate Catholics. We're all Catholic up here. So please leave us out of your mess. You know? Leave us alone. And in the middle of all this bunch is you have the native groups like the Haudenosaunee and the Cherokee to the south and the Delaware and all other groups in here. And they're going, oh, Mary, oh, no, please, this is not going to go well for us. You know, this is so not going to go well for us. And
It's a
the
clusterfuck,
British,
to put it that way.
yeah. And the British are saying, and they're saying to the British, could you please contain your babies? You know, please contain, because, you know, they will start another fight. These guys will fight at our heart. They will do another. No, please contain your kids. So these are the sides. If you look at the population, we divide into threes. At first, 1774, 75, most are probably middle ground to loyalist. Loyalist meaning I am ticked off with Parliament, but it is morally wrong for me to say to revolt. No, I'm going to obey the law. I know what the law says. I'm going to pay my taxes. I'm a little fussed at about it, and I might grumble, but I'm not going to shoot the sheriff. Okay, you know, there is a small group that are very rabid at really. Mary Beth Dorn, a good historian I like very much, would probably argue with me on this one because it would say 74, 75 is when you start seeing revolutionary feeling. I think it's in the 1760s, even 50s. I think there are some that just so blamed ornery, you know, that they just want a problem. And they're going to keep it going. They're going to stoke that furnace for all it's worth. And it doesn't matter who wants to make peace. They're going to make sure you can't have peace. So we got those. As the British react, that middle group gets smaller. Okay? And they get smaller because they're joining what we now call the Patriot side. You know, when I say Patriot, I mean those who are going to fight against the British. They're ready to pick up their rifles and shoot. They're going to join the militia. They might even join an army. They're that ticked off, you know. And so they're bit by bit peeling off the middle ground, the people who can negotiate. The loyalists, they're going to get a little smaller as some become a little disenchanted, you know, with Parliament. And they're kind of joining the middle ground. So you're seeing this shift move to the left. Guess the radical side. You use that if you use the conservative right, liberal left side here. So a bigger group, the dissident churches like the Baptist, and Presbyterian, and Congregational, they are more inclined. In fact, they're leaning early on to side with the politics of the left wing. They are moving rapidly toward that one, whereas Catholics say, "Oh, please leave me alone." Although a lot of them are going to become patriots. Carroll, for example, from Maryland, is going to be a sign of the Declaration of Independence. He is going to be an ardent patriot. Quakers are going to say they're pacifists. They're going to say, no, we oppose this. They might not like British policy, but they're not going to be in the war, and they're going to be separate, you know, lead separate. We have a Sons of Liberty group, which is, again, this is like the IRA.
Was the revolution inevitable at this point, or did it still have been?
Oh man, I hate that word, but I think it was bound. I think by 74, it was rolling that way. I'm not. Here's why I say inevitability is a dangerous word, but I'm not sure where it could peel off. I'm not sure where it could peel off. I think the British have been really smart. They could have kept the southern colonies held together if they would have just looked at what was going on. In fact, one of the wiser things to do, which was rejected by other Parliament, is that, look, elect delegates yourselves and will join Parliament. But the British had the idea, and this is kind of what we're faced with in modern America, virtual representation. One person cannot represent too many. You have to have enough who are from your spot to be trusted. I don't, the British Parliament, and it's a noble idea. I mean, I admit, I love the thought. It's very virtuous.
But in practice,
In practice, it sucks. It stinks. But I said, I'm from, if I'm from, I'm a part. I'm from Oxford. Let's say I'm a member of the Lords or I'm a member of the Parliament from Oxford, but I don't just represent Oxford. I represent the whole empire, which means I'm going to look and interview agents from around the empire, and I'm going to represent you because I'm going to learn what's wrong there. It's virtuous. It shows a selflessness, which they will head up here. It wasn't here. They still had their interests at heart. Humans are a greedy, sodding bunch. We are not virtuous by nature. I mean, many have a virtue sometimes, but a lot of times that virtue is kind of weak. We have a weak spots. We have our blind spots. We have our prejudices and bigotries. Americans knew that Parliament could not possibly represent them. And by I'd say 74, there was no way they were going to elect anybody to go to England and perpetually stay there, rotate representatives constantly there. Because it wasn't in the British mindset yet. It became later on, but it wasn't there yet. It hasn't evolved anywhere really yet. This is kind of new. This is really very new on the planet. It's new. And it evolves. It's not planned out. This is not a plan. No one's got this in their mind. When we have people here who really absurdly say, what's the original intent? There is none. They can't have original intent because they didn't know where this was going, baby. This is, they're whacking through deep weeds here. They don't know where it's going. And they know that when they write something out like the Declaration of Independence or our Constitution, that it is going to have to go through decades of legal debate to form a law, So it's vague. It's meant to be vague. But they believe in a more direct representation, not one-to-one, but at least close, somewhat close, and enough so that the voices are given an honest hearing. That's not ready yet. And the British anchored down, oh my goodness. I should have brought the books with me here, laid them from me so I remember what I'm talking about. Several books recently came out. The 5 Men Who Lost America. It's a great book because it looks at British leaders who are from Lord North and King George and Grenville and even General Howes. They really failed to grasp some things, what was going on in the Americas. Also, how serious the problem was early on, which is a typical problem for many politicians. You understate the damage this is going to cause. You said, it's fine. It's not fine.
At what point did they start to realize maybe we should send a few more troops to the colonies?
74.
Maybe we should begin to mobilize.
74. Hutchinson asked, and Governor, even before Hutchinson asked for more troops because rioting's gotten bad. People get killed in riots. And you're getting very concerned. Boston is a riot capital, baby. You have Mariners, and they know how to riot. Oh, yeah. We're ready to go. Bring the clubs out. We'll burn things down, torch stuff. Riots get out of hand. What starts as a protest, but these are, again, you're looking at a class of people who are coming from a mindset going centuries back, where it is my right to show my discontent by burning your house down. It is my right to cause some damage. Now, they can't fight like a army. They're a riot group. And it's not organized, it's disorganized. Sam Adams knows how to use this, but the poor guy really doesn't know how bad can be. So he gets people stoked up and he can't, the dog's off the leash. He can't control it. So when his cousin John Adams comes to defend the soldiers at the Boston Massacre, he has to show these are not controlled. This is not a controlled situation. He's let things get out of hand. Now he can't let people know because his stupid cousin is doing it. You have to kind of separate your elite from your wild kids, men and women, and kids who are throwing the rocks. You have to kind of keep that under, you have to separate this thing, but it's all one. You get the one stokes the other up. And so there is this exploitation. Yeah. But is the problem real? Yes. And here's where the historian becomes boring. The story is complex. It's messy. I'm saying yes and no to everything. You say, but I want a simple story. It's not simple. This is really, really messy. Hang on, kids. And then you get to the point where the British are, okay, I'm going to lay down the law and I'm going to send troops in and I'm going to take away the gunpowder. To be honest, it was not our gunpowder. The parliament would budget so many tons of gunpowder to each colony to be distributed to the various stations in the colonies because of past native wars. Now, the colonies bring up a percentage of their own, that's powder and shot. This is basically what you use to fight with. Say a powder and shot that Massachusetts, for example, sits at, okay, it's ours. And the British, they supply another match to that. The British coming in and saying, okay, we're taking our supply back because you're going to shoot at us. They've already realized the danger. The Americans are literally saying, I mean out loud, but they're actually saying and thinking themselves, I have a right to shoot at you. British go, no, you don't. We're taking our powder back. Thank you. They got away with it in 74. A powder alarm where the British came in and they, well, rock and roll, got out the door. Well, rumor spread like America. We were so bad at rumors, dude. All of a sudden, the rumor had it that, and this is during the first Continental Congress, and that 100 people got massacred by British troops. They shot my horse. They, burned houses down. No, the British.
So it's kind of like the hen with the one that loses one feather story.
Oh, all over. Complete crap load of rumor. And of course, the right, and of course, you get been like Paul Revere, the propagandist, and rolling with this baby, roll with it. I don't care what the truth is. We're gonna roll with the propaganda. The bigger, better, the best, and rolling it out. The British can't control it. They have absolutely no control over this. Hutchinson is now become the governor. He is called the ultimate turncoat, and they hate him worse than anyone else because he's born in America, is working for the British. He's now the royal governor, and he has to leave permanently, never come back. I feel for Hutchinson. Now, he's not equipped for this. This is not the brightest tool in the shed, but he is not at fault either. He is completely overwhelmed by circumstances that I'm not sure anybody's going to manage well, unless you have ultimate knowledge and the TARDIS next by with Doctor Who, giving you the advice. You're going to need that kind of, the future. Well, like anybody of us know, I don't know what's coming up. I have no idea of the future, so I'm acting blind. When we look back at 1775, they're acting blind. So April 75, the British again come in. We're going to go to Concord. We know there's a large powder stock that belongs to the British, the Crown powder. We got to get that out of there because things are already getting out of control. They think they have control and they don't. There are so many, the Bostons are so spy-ridden. The British can't even go to the bathroom without a colonial spy knowing when it's done, okay? The network is pure and simply wonderful. The British are moving out. And the thing, remember, the British troops, they come in, the British never have enough support for them. They're making the town support them in their barns and whatnot. And so remember, these British troops have been here now for a couple of years. They have married local girls. those local girls are not part of the common, they're part of the British Army as the followers. So you don't have a tight network here anymore. It's very porous, you know. I mean, they're interrelated here. The troops and the locals, and they don't like it. Oh my gosh, it's a mess. It is delightfully messy, you know.
I want to talk a little bit about, how, because you mentioned how the colonies kind of hated each other. So it's astonishing, really,
Oh yeah, yeah,
how they managed to form a revolutionary army that beat the British in the first place.
yeah,
So let's talk a little bit about how,
sure.
they formed the revolutionary army. Like I said, like we said, the colonies hated each other. So how did were they able to form this army?
Committees of correspondence. Sam Adams, when Sam Adams, I think that they credit him with some of its idea. You send out committees of correspondence, and their only job is to correspond, link through mail every colonial legislature. Now, these legislatures are now extra legal. By 75, they're all extra legal because the governors have closed down the legislatures. They just go to the pub and they meet again. All right. They're at the tavern, like the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, Virginia. And they're not the state house, but they're at the tavern. And they're re-meeting again. Now, it is not a true representation. This is a group that's very limited. You don't have those loyalists who love the British, or at least they're favorable to the British. They're not invited to the party. So what you have by 75, even 74, you have a representative body meeting extra legally, and they're only meeting with that group. They're not meeting with those who are opposed to this. And so you've already excluded probably at almost half your population. Maybe more, likely more. They're not even in the discussions. They're not being talked to. They're not part of the whole activity. They're left out. And so the representation is completely skewed to the angry group. The angry group is communicating with other angry groups. The angers in Massachusetts are talking with the angers in New York City. There's not much of a New York State, by the way, New York City. And then they're talking to Pennsylvania. So they're in Philadelphia. And then they're in Charleston. And they're in Williamsburg. And Raleigh, so they're all, and those are the ones talking. And so you've limited the numbers you have to deal with to just your angry groups. You have a lovely network of communication to link those men mostly together. A lot of women are tied, but they're not officially, but they are into this as well. And so because they did this first with the various boycotts. Committees of correspondence kept the boycotts going. The Sons of Liberty enforced the boycotts. Sons of Liberty were lousy. Militia was terrible for troops. They were awful troops. They were just awful troops, But they could terrorize a community and keep your loyalist in line. They were able to enforce the boycott of tea.
We have to, of course, speaking of boycott of tea, we have to, of course, talk about the Boston Tea Party.
That's right. October 74. 74, yeah. So the Tea Party, this again, they're arguing with the British will backtrack, but because again, they have shares in the British East India Company. The British East India Company is a powerful lobby in Parliament.
As I always say, the British East India Company is the only evil company that managed successfully to take over the world.
Yeah. Basically, yeah. You could see them as a James Bond villain, really. It fits. They own, they control stunning amounts of wealth. They link the empire. They're losing money, and they need to gain it by really tightening the tax control, not raising the tax, like they're lowering the taxes, but they're tightening who can pay or not. Basically everybody's, they're tightening the controls. Americans, like I said before, there's seventh graders who never had rules before, and all of a sudden you're tightening screws down. It doesn't matter that this has always been a law. They've been able to ignore it, now they can't. That is if it doesn't matter. It's treated as a new thing. Parliament doesn't get it. There are a few, I think Pitt does. Pitt's going, this is not going to work, guys. You're going to screw this up, Wilberforce, another one, says, don't do this. This is you're really going to screw this up, He was definitely opposed to us. No, you're idiots. You think it's going to work. It doesn't. And so the communities of correspondence find a linkage, and it's, I hate the Parliament. Quebec is the one drawback, says they leave me alone. Leave me alone.
As always.
Yeah, leave me alone out of your mess. You're going to screw things up. I don't like it either, but I'm certainly not going to follow you guys. Nova Scotia is dependent on the British Navy. That's their only business, really. Maritime power with the British Navy. They got to have that.
We observed this. We discussed alternative history in a different episode a few years ago. But I want to ask another alternative history question about alternative history. Let us say they have been more friendlier with each other, the colonies, and then gotten more alone. Is there a chance that perhaps if Canada and Quebec could have been a part of America today, that they could have
I
been
think
part
so.
of the
I think
United States?
it would be difficult because Quebec being Catholic and New England being so utterly anti-Catholic. In fact, when Franklin and others arranged the French treaty, New England was not happy with that treaty. We don't need no statement French treaty. We don't need those Catholic. We don't, they had this blind spot against Catholicism. It's really hard in the 21st century to keep that in mind. There is a hatred there that goes back 3 centuries. And it's an earned anger. I mean, there are realities here behind this, but in that age, it was too fresh. It was too fresh. And no one was willing to let it go. So Quebec knew not to trust. In fact, their best, because they're having the fur trade, their best luck would be to keep a happy relationship with natives, which means the demarcation line drawn in 63, 64, to keep the 13 colonies out of Trans-Appalachia. That would have kept the peace with natives, but the greed, and I'm being blunt, this is where I think the liberals, the leftists, arguing that the Howard Zinn school of history is probably most correct, in that was an utter sin on the 13 colonists' part. They were land greedy. I mean, full stop. Full-blown land greedy. The Spanish do it, the French do it, and the natives certainly knew it. They were land greedy. They wanted, and they would do anything, and I mean anything, to grab that land. No dishonesty, no torture, no torture. Torture was too much. There was no red line to cross on this one. They would do anything for that land. It is one of the most shameful, humiliating parts of what we now call American culture. And we can't divorce ourselves from it. That is too deep into the identity and the founding generation. And the thing is, that generation knew it. That's not a hidden thing. Anyway, and so this is the moral thinking, again, 250 years later, looking back on it. So anyway, community correspondence linked the 13 together. That community correspondence put the first Continental Congress together. The second one was things were not going well. And this is in 75, after the Boston Tea Party. This was going, then the closure of the Boston Act, Second Continental Congress, and then the screw up of all screw ups. British troops sent in to Concord. They bumped into a group of militia, raw by accident, at Lexington. Someone My theory, and it's only a theory, and I don't think I can back it up, is that I think Hancock or Adams fired a shot in the air just to make him angry. I think someone just did it to tick somebody off. It may have been a random farmer, I don't know. No one got hurt on the British side, but somebody shot at the British. The ball hit a British trooper, but it was spent. The British cut loose, and then all you know what broke loose.
So let's talk about the revolution itself. That of
Yeah,
course would lead to, and I would discuss as well. Was it inevitable that it would be an patriotic
yeah.
victory as
We're
well? So
dragging
let's
on here.
talk a little
I
bit
love
about
this.
the revolution.
All right, give me a yeah. The revolution itself rolls into gear. It rolls into gear after Concord. The Congress has not declared independence yet. It doesn't represent enough people. They do that, but they're doing it. They take on themselves the role of representatives. They don't represent that much. A lot of Americans are horrified at this. A lot of your radicals, they're okay, go for it, baby. But the fighting has already started. After Concord, the fighting continues. So 75 is when April 75, the fighting starts. It doesn't stop until 83. Even though 81 was Yorktown, there were frontier fighting until 83, 84, 85, 86, going on here. But the Boston is sieged. British troops pull back into Boston. Many people in Boston are patriots. They vacate the city. British set up a defense system that could not be taken by storm. You're not going to do it. Congress sends in George Washington. He volunteers. He can, he's got some experience in the military. He takes over. He's kind of terrified. He looks at his New Massachusetts troops and goes, "Oh my gosh, what am I going to do with these guys?" He hates New Englanders. Absolutely despises them. And they set up a siege line around that. Before Washington gets there, there's a fight at Breed's Hill as Americans try to set up artillery to basically bomb Boston. They fail to do that. The British take Breed's Hill back. It is a bloodbath. It is Packingham makes a Packingham. They make a rather stupid error of doing a frontal assault because they want to prove themselves. Just doesn't work out. It's a strategic screw up on the British part. Really.
I want to talk to me. I misspoke, and then I made an episode with Woody Holton, whom I know you know.
Yeah, it's a complete
we made an episode on the American Revolution I think it was a few years ago now, which it's absolutely should check
yeah,
out.
link it back in here.
But he meant talk about black slaves as being a part of the revolution as well, and especially on the British side, how they said if you are joining our side, we'll give you freedom, and you can.
Yeah, Alan Taylor wrote about this. Internal Enemy. Great book. Now on the revolution, they were more split because, depending if you were free black or enslaved, you're looking for, okay, who can give you a good deal? How can I and my family get out of this really bad circumstance? And the British did not, yes, they started to in Virginia with Governor Dunmore, but it didn't go through. War of 1812, much more aggressively, and it's very successful. Anyway, you have this going on. And Chris Baddox was black, possibly Indian black mix, but he's a mariner. Mariners are a much more egalitarian group of people. If you can sail a ship, you're on board. Anyway, Breed's Hill, Washington comes in, lays siege to Boston. Knox's new bookseller General Knox, he's sent to Ticonderoga. We're trying to find troops. We're trying to get, they're trying to invade Canada. First, they're trying to invade Canada. To force them thinking if we invade Canada, they'll enjoy us with open arms.
They are so nice anyway. They just basically let us in.
Yeah, did somebody not? Who thought this idea was a good idea? You realize that there are some really unthinking things going on here. Even at that time, they should have, even in that time period, they should realize if you're coming in with an army, did you have no idea what's going on? Did you have no idea what's in that? The thing is, you don't know what's going on the ground. You really don't. Um, and you haven't paid attention. I mean, at a mythic level, have not paid attention. Anyway, so that fails. The siege of Boston succeeds in that so you're pulling your loyalists out of the city. They'll go back to Nova Scotia. They'll reform, invade in New York.
Hmm.
So the fight will start shifting to the south constantly through the
Were the
war.
loyalists in the colonies that fought for the British side as well? Like, we still were like we still want to be in the colony, so we're just gonna join the
It's really
British.
hard. Yeah, the what if is because the British, like Lincoln assumed there were a lot of loyalists in the Confederacy. There was never enough. Not enough, and they were not in power areas. They were not unified and not in a power zone. They could join a British troop, but your Sons of Liberty are a very effective way to terrorize your loyalists. Are you willing, as a loyalist, to have your family burned out of your homes?
Hmm.
Because they will be. If you're a loyalist, you will. I mean, if you one family, I mean, families split over this issue.
It was
A
blackmail, in
husband,
other words.
a loyalist husband is abandoned by his wife. She says, "No, do not count me with him. I reject my husband. He is a loyalist and no husband of mine." Um, and she gets support from the British for being a persecuted loyalist. The British are not supportive enough of the loyalists because they're the ones who take it worst. Actually, second worst. The worst of all, the native. That they got the raw end of that deal big time. The war goes on through officially 83. The army stopped moving in 81 after Yorktown. The British know there is no way on God's good earth we're going to win this one. Now, there were generals. Amherst knew this one. Amherst was offered command of all the British forces, I think it's 75, 76. And he says, not without, I think he said 90,000 troops. George goes, no, no chance. He
I
goes,
think, and though Andrew Roberts is an apologist for the Empire, but still in his biography on George III, he mentioned that George could have sent in more troops if he wanted that, and he painted him kind of not in the tyrant as he was, of course, painted by the Patriots,
oh,
who
yeah.
of course wanted to paint him as the villain of the story, and
No,
and again he wasn't as bad as at least the
no,
Americans made him out to be.
no.
Of course, towards the end of his life, but he said Roberts point out that he could have sent in more troops and
Yeah.
probably could have crushed the revolution if he wanted to.
This
But
would have been,
he had also other things on his mind and back then, and but he chose not to.
no,
So,
no.
what do you think about this statement that he
Yeah,
could have
it's a tough one
sent in
because,
troops?
yeah, you would have had to squash New England first and hard. I mean, I don't know. If you would have bombed and burned Boston and then just simply mowed down and then given the natives free reign. So look, if you see a colonist there, free reign to take them out. Carte blanche. Um, you would have had to, well, you almost committed a genocide in New England to do it. Uh, the British have, I mean, except for your Irish, somehow, uh, if they had fought in the Americans like they did in Ireland, but I think you would have had a permanent enemy out of it. But the population is already huge here. This is already a very large population, and the problem is they had already formed. The British Empire had made a lot of enemies, or at least those who could be enemies. Like I said, it's that middle ground. I don't really like you that much, but I'm not willing to fight against you because I want to be left alone. The more you squeeze, the more those people who want to be left alone are going to say, I've had enough.
The British at the time, like you said, they weren't favorable allies. Nobody wanted to be allies with them until maybe after the Napoleonic Wars. They were
Yeah, yeah,
struggling. They were basically
yeah.
in the, at
No,
least in the early part of Napoleonic War,
they
they
were
were
not. Yeah,
alone.
and the thing is, Americans, we use such language. We really do. We beat the biggest empire on the planet. No, you didn't. The British were a navy power. They were never a land power. Their land power was always anemic. They did not have big land army. Never had big. It's an island for pity's sakes, you know.
Mm.
They can't fit that many people in, and they kept exporting them constantly. I mean, they had already exported tens of thousands of Scots. They had already ticked off the clearances. They had really ticked off huge numbers of the Scots who may have been willing to be loyal, but they had, so you had already irritated many of the Catholic population. You had irritated many of the Protestant and Catholic Scots. The Irish just despised them intently, and so you have a big chunk of your own on who hates you. They had fought against the French. The French have a long grudge match with the English. The Spanish aren't real in a loving relationship. And the Dutch would look at their decline as only a good thing. So you don't have many friends, anyway.
And I want to go back to the American War, and let's talk about, of course, signing the armistice with the Patriots, and of course the famous 4th July, which is of course
Okay,
why
all right.
why it is the 4th July, and let's talk
Yeah, as we
about
go
the
in here, yeah.
Declaration of Independence.
4th of July. John Adams, in fact, he wrote very famously that he assumed the 2nd of July would be celebrated forever with celebrations, fireworks, speeches, music bands, all that kind of things. Yeah, we do. Look at me, Um, uh, partially, but he just got the date wrong. I think because the 4th became the announcement day, whereas the 2nd was when it was actually passed. John, being a lawyer, thought, yeah, when it was actually took effect, well, the 2nd. But when was it announced? The 4th. Okay, the 4th. And it really, at the very beginning, it becomes a public holiday. And it is owned by darn near everybody. And it takes on the combinations of an outdoor church service, a camp meeting, a drunken brawl,
Of course,
a free for all. It takes on all sorts of bizarre things. And when you get into the 19th century, though, it takes on a religious tone, which for me is where it actually becomes bothersome. Because now I'm looking at it, wait a minute, being Christian myself, I don't like mixing the two together. That doesn't belong. Because when I look at a political movement as a religious movement, that's when people get burned at the stake, I mean, that's serious. And I don't want those two mixed. And many of the founders, for example, particularly those who were like the Presbyterian, Congregational Baptist groups, they were the most militant in separating your church and state. They were the most determined. Oh, no, 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 no. We will giggly happy fight in the wars. We'll giggly happy go with, we'll support the nation, but don't. No, I don't. They would not have put an American flag in the church pulpit. They would not have sung a national anthem in the kirk, in church. No, 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 no. Those babies got to be separate. It's when we get into the 19th century, Lincoln refers to as our political religion, things get dodgy. Now, many Christian patriots, pastors particularly, used the religious language in the Revolution, God's grace is on us, kind of thing, as a way of stoking a 4th of July religious patriotism.
when
So
was
we
the
have
national anthem written as
uh,
the anthem of the United
oh, it doesn't
States?
become it is well, it's written in 1814, 15, 14. It doesn't become a national anthem until the 1930s, I think, 20s or 30s. I mean, it's a patriotic song, It doesn't become that. And that is, we start to become this highly toxic religious political mix comes out of the 20th century. But we don't even have the language of Judeo-Christian put together until the 30s or 40s. That isn't even, those words don't even go together. Jewish, Christian, excuse me, even the 19th century go, what does that mean? I mean, I don't grasp that one. It don't go together. It's in the 20th century, and it doesn't really mean anything. That's the horrible thing. Both Jews and Christians go, scratch our heads because the things they come together are almost universals. Thou shalt not kill. Buddhists have that one. And, thou shalt not steal. But Islam will say that, So you don't really have, those are universals that basically, if you have any remote degree of personal virtue, we can agree with those things. I'm not arguing with that. But it's not Jewish or Christian necessarily. Yes, they would agree with it, but so does everybody else. If they're at least noble enough to not want to hurt one another, they agree with that. So anyway,
I want to ask, well, there's a few symbols I want to talk about when it comes to American freedom, and you know what I mean, the eagle. And I also have a joke about why the eagle, and because I have a joke where I drove that I don't understand why the eagle is the symbol of freedom in America. It's a predator. It hunts for the weak and those who can't defend themselves. Oh, well, wait a minute. Now I get it. Yeah, but seriously though, why is the eagle was the eagle chosen as a freedom of liberty for the United States?
It mimicked European empires. That'd be blunt. Franklin was opposed to it. And there's somewhat apocryphal stories of natives, talking about that one. And it could be too, that's because they were, people, they were aware of what was going on too. And because, and I use the word like that first Congress, this founding generation, and it's a mixed bag of guys here. And it goes from Washington and Adams to Jefferson to Hamilton to Benjamin Rush, the doctor. It goes to Noah Webster, the dictionary scholar. It goes to many others, men and women who were in the politics of that age, who are writing about things. They may not have been representatives, but they're writing. They're not in politics, but they're writing and they're speaking. A lot of them see some form of empire because they're looking at a republic in a different language altogether. Now, men like Patrick Henry, republic is Virginia. And that's the only republic he sees. He sees other republics as confederated with us, but they're not us. When we get to 1789, 88, 87, 88, 89, it's becoming more obvious that the Confederation is going to bust up and they're going to fight one another. And one of the European powers is going to take advantage of that one. Spain, they're going to take advantage of that one. So the second movement.
And that's kind of what happened in the Haitian Revolution when you see.
Yeah. But Haiti is a race revolution. This is one race that had enough, and they outnumbered the white. And the Haitian Revolution has a dark and horrible impact on the American federal era because they see the Haitian Revolution as, and this is what drags Southerners in becoming more militant into the slave power because they see themselves as the next victim. Yeah, you've hurt these people. They have a right to get back at you. I look at, dude, you deserve it.
I want to talk a little bit about crafting the Constitution as well, because that's, of course, is an important part of the American independence. But that wasn't, as far as I understand, it wasn't written until a few years after the Declaration of Independence in
1788. It's crafted. The Declaration, and it isn't now. Remember, these documents evolve. This is where we tend to really this. You don't grasp this one. The documents evolve a lot. Not that they were changed, but their meaning changed. The Declaration of Independence has the preamble. That's the only part we use. That part becomes used in the 19th century, particularly by Abraham Lincoln, to form a general philosophical underpinning of how to read the Constitution, which has evolved itself from 1789 when it's adopted. The Constitution, and Charles Beard argued back in 1917 that the Constitution is a bit of a foist by an affluent elite on America to control the over-democratic impulses. He's right and he's wrong. Like a lot of historians say, yeah, no. Yes, these are elite. Yes, it's not really representative. Now, it has some gorgeously glorious ideas.
But again, in practice,
the checks and balances, that's probably one of the most masterful things we've ever done. The checks and because you need some way of using the natural greed of humanity to contain separate power. The British had, and it was the opposite of what the British were doing. What they had were shared powers. The Parliament would share with the king, would share with the boards of trade, would share with, and they would all share power happily. Well, as you know, that doesn't work out in practice.
Was there ever a chance that they would have, like, again, like you said, in Britain, would they have the House of Commons and the House of Lords? Was that ever going to be was there debate with if they should have this in America, where they had the House of Commons and the House of Lords in a way?
The reacting, well, is because now they did mimic it because they had a Senate. The Senate, though, they picked because these guys read the classics so much and they fashioned themselves as the new Roman Republic.
Yeah.
Not a good model to follow, but they did do history. They did politics, not history. Okay, these were not historians. All of us would argue, no, they were lousy historians. In fact, lousy historians, but they didn't have what I had. Anyway, they imaged themselves, and the Senate would be your elder statesmen who were more experienced in state politics, who had already had a chance to work with other states in their own spheres of influence. Maybe served as a governor, state senator, legislature for years. So these men are already going to be in their 40s, 30s and 40s at least. Not their 90s we got now. Anyway, sidetrack. Anyway, so you have this elder statesman, and then you have the representatives who are going to be a little more dodgy. They're going to be wild kids. All right. They're younger. They're coming together. But when we develop this, the real power is still in the states. So if you want a significant political career, you don't go to the federal office. You go to the state offices. That's where your career is. It's a dead end to go to Congress. For years, it was a dead end. So Congress was actually your third-rate politicians. By the time you get into even the 1890s, George Bush, our first president, looked at it and says, these are only third-rate men. These are terrible. Oh my gosh, we're the first-rate guys. They were inexperienced. They were jealous. They were not even very bright. They were not educated. They were unfamiliar with what we're to do. They were just happy to be there in New York City, Philadelphia. Oh my gosh, gee whiz. And so, the few of the elite like Madison kind of, oh my gosh, this is going to be rough. This is going to be a rough road here. He's trying to, work with his fellow representatives. He's a young guy himself. And Hamilton comes in and he becomes a Secretary of Treasury, and he's just working out things. He's a negotiator. He's a big doer. He sees big time. And he immediately falls afoul of Hamilton and then Adams, or Jefferson and Adams. Governor Morris is he's sticking up with all of you. It's a mess. It is a real hardship going on here because they don't, within 5 years of the Constitution, we have parties. And when the Declaration and the Constitution are both developed, the representatives never envisioned because a party. That's a British thing. That's a French thing. We don't do that. We are all Americans. We have various factions, but we'll never, ever, ever have a party.
What
And so
about choosing Washington D.C. as the capital? Or was it even Washington D.C.? Was it created from like scratch? When
there
they
was
decided that this is going to be the capital of the new United States of America.
there's a few functions going on here. By the 1790s, there was already a division and an anger over slave representation. Representatives in Virginia, for example, they get to count representatives elected to Congress based on slaves who cannot be elected. So they're overrepresented right at the front. That gives them far more votes than they deserved. They did not deserve that number of votes at all. And therefore, they can control much in the Congress way beyond their numbers. So there's anger over this issue. There is anger over the two economies that have already evolved. Hamilton's merchant and trade, which he was, beginning to encourage. New York City, Philadelphia were merchant cities. Williamsburg, Richmond was not. These are planter capitals. They were urban areas with warehouses, and their only link was Europe. Their big thing was they would link raw material to a manufacturing area. They were forming very different economies. Because of the slave influence, they were forming very different political structures. The fear of the Haitian Revolution would form a restrictive, and we're seeing actually even by the late 1600s, we're seeing black codes. We're seeing race as a basis for slavery evolving, even in the 1670s. And now by 1790s, it's much more anchored in place. It's just that many would think, I don't think it's going to last that long because it really is expensive. It's inefficient. Cotton would change that dramatically because it becomes then steeply, profoundly profitable. And that would enhance the division already in the 1790s. It didn't make it, it enhanced it. It gave it fire. The parties are split. It's nice. It's not as accurate, but if you look at Jefferson and Hamilton as your two sides, look at how their writings and the material, they kind of represent, and in that age, those two men would represent parties forming around them. The language of parties was always an insult. They were in parties, but didn't believe they were in them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So you have this separation. And the problem is, let's say Jefferson, or I'll use my buddy. We're studying now Benjamin Rush, doctor in Philadelphia. Rush, who's a man of many words, not a few words, very arrogant sometimes, can't keep his mouth shut. Brilliant guy, just not very socially astute. When someone argues with him politically, that is not a mere political debate. It is a betrayal of the revolution. Does that language sound familiar to you when you study things like the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution later on? You betrayed the revolution. That's a death penalty right there. You go to the guillotine for that. You go to the chamber for,
I want to compare a little bit as well, because you mentioned the Russian Revolution, where immediately after, when Lenin took power, there was the civil war and you spoke a little bit about this, but there was a civil war with I guess the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, but was there worry after the Declaration of Independence, and were the people that wanted us, because Lenin wanted a civil war,
Yeah,
after the revolution. But was there people in Congress and in Parliament that wanted, a civil war, and where was the danger that there would be a civil war in the
there is,
newfound
but we
United
have,
States?
well, because we're born in revolution, we always are going to fight with chaos. Revolutions do not bring order, they bring chaos. Chaos brings factions. Factions bring civil wars. It's the weakness of the system and our history. Knowing our history is essential on an honest, rather dark fashion, because you got to realize.
And again, sorry for interrupting you again, but to do a comparison to what you're saying, just in terms of Cuba and Che Guevara, after their revolution, they cherished the spread the revolution again to other countries.
By the revolution,
Because they
yes,
were born in a
yes.
revolution, they also spread the revolution
Hmm?
on. So there's truth to what you say, and this is just a comparison to what to
It's
kind of
yeah,
confirm
and
what
those are
you're
very
saying is
good
true.
comparisons. And they over centuries apart, but they're still there. I think that might just enhance the nature of, and how many colonies in Africa, who were colonies in Africa, became independent after revolutions. They had their own instability because they're formed in
Mm.
revolutions. Mexico, like all South America, every one of them was formed in a revolution. It enhances a natural instability in human nature, because you've already done it once. The Reformation, Protestants can't stay together because they've already separated from Catholicism. And doing so, you can't ever unify again. You've broken the mold. And you have no right to say you can't.
Mhm.
So there's my preaching here. Sorry.
I think
But
yeah, I think we're gonna round it up there. So it's been
yeah,
a great pleasure to
yeah,
have you back, of course, and I
we're
will
going
see you
to
next time when we
yeah
record.
wrap this up here. Let me
Yeah,
wrap this up here.
so we are going to. I will of course see you again when we are going to record the next Star Trek episode, or Star Trek podcast episode, and which I'm really looking forward to because that is going to be a fun one. And before we go, do you have anything else you want to promote? And if people have questions about, of course, our first episode together, I
Yeah.
should add
What
that was the
yeah,
episode on Abraham Lincoln. So you
yeah.
absolutely
Okay.
should check out that one
We
as
discussed
well,
it
which was
some
one of the
more.
first episodes of the podcast. But you should. But do you yourself have anything you want to promote or any social media where
Most
people can find you?
social media wise, there are two podcasts or one podcast I listen to quite regularly, and I'm a part of through the book club, and that is Ben Franklin's World podcast. It's out of Williamsburg, Virginia, and we get a lot of historians who really begin to promote wonderful books and writings and museums that deep dives into the weeds of American political and social culture. The book club I'm part of, which is related to this, is Poor Richard's Book Club. Ben Franklin's World, Poor Richard's Book Club. Yeah, I get it. We do the deep dive into actual readings as a Zoom podcast. We're on Facebook, Poor Richard's Book Club. And in that, we read books and we actually get a chance on Zoom to talk with the authors. I'll usually lead one thing myself, and the others will moderate, but I will always moderate the chat. And then we work out and we publish those or on Facebook. And it's a fun gang, only about 200, 300 of us. But the live podcast is really a live, I guess, podcast is fun because you get to discuss as a small group. If you don't want to do that, fine. You can just watch the recordings later on and chat online with us. And it's a good chance to kind of do a deep dive in a very unthreatening manner. We keep things happy and simple and non-political because that could get dodgy, particularly over here now. We have people on several continents who they kind of go, oh, we're like 7 time zones, So yeah, but see us on Facebook. You can take a look and see, is this something I want to hang out with? It's good. But the Ben Franklin World podcast is a very good opening gateway to this study.
Thank you again for coming on to this podcast for a fifth time. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. This has been Well That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. That would be very nice. You can give us one if you hated this episode for some
Oh, come
reason. I
on,
don't know.
no, not a
But
one. No.
if you're on Apple Podcast, should write a review and tell us what you liked about the podcast or what you didn't like. If you're on YouTube, leave a comment or like, share, and subscribe. Make sure to check out our Star Trek podcast. It's really fun. And if you like Star Trek and like history, you're gonna love the podcast because we are going to do so much on, and hopefully we may even interview some Star Trek royalty as well in the future. That would be a dream of mine. So we'll see where the podcast goes. There's no telling. We release episode 2 weeks, 2 times a month, so it's not weekly as this one, but it's still worth checking out. This has been What That Aged Well. My name's Alan, and I'll see you next time.